The air in Delphi, Indiana feels thin and cool in mid-February, the kind that carries the faint scent of damp leaves. You're standing near the Monon High Bridge Trail, where gravel shifts softly under careful footsteps. In a town like this, a trail is usually just a familiar line through the trees, a place people mention casually. But on one afternoon in 2017, routine concern begins to take on structure, and then coordination. You can picture the first decisions forming quietly. Who notes the time, who marks a path, who keeps a simple log. Outdoors, nothing holds still for long, so preserving what can be preserved becomes its own kind of patience. And early on, there's a detail investigators recognize as rare, something recorded that might help anchor a timeline. Soon, local officers, county deputies, state police, and federal support settle into roles, careful not to step on each other's work. Tonight, you'll move slowly through those first hours and feel how an investigation learns to breathe minute by minute. The first concrete change is simple, and it happens the way these things often do, through a phone call that doesn't get returned right away. Two friends, two families, a plan for a daytime walk, and then the hours slipping past the time everyone expected them home. In Delphi, that kind of delay usually has an easy answer. A dead battery, a ride that took longer, a missed message. But as late afternoon leans toward evening, the easy answers don't arrive, and the concern becomes organized. Someone calls, and then someone else does, and then a small group begins to form at the trailhead. A sign in logbooks and lives that the night is going to be different than expected. You can feel the first decision point settle on your shoulders. Do you treat this like a normal missing persons check, careful and polite, or do you prepare for a search that might need more hands than a small town can offer? In those first moments, you don't get to know which choice is right. You just choose the one that gives you more options later. So you begin the call-outs. You ask for volunteers who know the trails, who know the backlots, who know where a teenager might sit when she needs quiet. And as names are written down, you realize you'll need a simple system, a place to record who went where and when. Because when the woods go dark, memory starts to soften at the edges. The trail itself isn't dramatic. It's a practical path, worn by shoes and seasons, with the old bridge standing as a kind of landmark people don't always think about until they're near it. You picture the Monon High Bridge stretching out, boards and gaps, and the sense of height that makes some visitors slow down without knowing why. Now, though, it's not a weekend curiosity. It's a grid on a map. And you begin to hear the language of a search, spoken in low voices, repeated to keep it straight. Which side of the creek? Which entrance? Which private property line? You make another small decision. You ask someone to keep a written log, not because you expect paperwork to solve anything, but because later, someone will need to know who stepped where. Later, someone will need to answer questions they can't even imagine yet. And for that, you need plain notes with plain times. As the first searchers move out, the early complication arrives quietly. It's winter in Indiana. And winter isn't just cold, it's a condition. The light fades sooner than you want, and the ground remembers every footstep. If you cover too much too fast, you can disturb the very things you might need to see. But if you move too slowly, you lose the hours when someone could still call out, could still hear you, could still come toward a voice. So you do what investigators do when the answer isn't clean. You split the work. Some people search for the living, calling names, listening for a reply. Other people begin to think like evidence technicians, and you can sense the handoff beginning before anyone says it out loud. The area is outdoors, which means it's always changing. Wind, moisture, animals, a person walking through without realizing what they're stepping over. You can't freeze a forest in place, but you can try to control the parts you touch. By the time the night settles in fully, a few truths have already taken shape. The girls were on the trail that afternoon. That much is steady. There are people who saw them or saw someone who might have crossed their path, and those accounts will matter later in ways no one wants to imagine. And then there's the early anomaly, the detail that makes seasoned detectives lift their heads. There may be recorded audio and video, not from a security system, not from a dash camera, but from a phone. A personal recording made close to the time the girls disappeared. It's rare, it's fragile, and it changes everything about how you think about time. Because a recording doesn't just suggest what happened, it pins the world to a particular second the way a thumbtack pins a paper map. If it's real, if it's usable, it becomes the kind of evidence you build careful walls around. You can feel the weight of that possibility even before you hear a single word of it. And so the response expands. Delphi is small, and the early work is local, but certain kinds of cases don't stay contained. County deputies step in, Indiana State Police bring structure and experience, and people who have done the long nights before. Then federal support offers resources that a town department doesn't keep on the shelf, not because anyone wants to take over, but because everyone can feel the scale of what's happening. Now you're thinking in terms of command posts and zones and tasking. You're thinking about the bridge between urgency and order, and you watch the way professionals choose their words carefully around families. Because the families are living inside every minute, the case becomes intensely personal and strangely procedural, all at once. A missing person search that's also becoming an evidence scene in slow motion. At some point, in the middle of all that movement, you notice another practical problem. People are arriving to help. They mean well, they want to be useful. But every well-meaning person is also another set of footprints, another set of hands that might touch a branch, or move a stone, or walk past something without noticing. So you make a calm choice that won't feel good to everyone. You begin to limit who goes where. You set boundaries. You ask some volunteers to stay near the command area instead, to keep lists, to run supplies, to keep the system from collapsing. It's not a heroic moment, it's a management moment. And in a case like this, management is one of the quiet ways you protect the truth. The first long night passes in pieces. Flashlights swing over brush, voices call names, then stop to listen. Radios crackle with check-ins that try to sound normal, even when nothing about the night feels normal. You can picture the paperwork growing, line by line. Who searched the South Trail? Who walked the creek line? Who checked a nearby road? And in between those lines, you feel the empty space where the answer should be. It's the kind of space investigators learn to sit with, not because they like it, because it's there and it has to be endured. Morning changes the rules. Daylight brings clarity, and with it the need for a different kind of control. With daylight, you can see more, but you can also disturb more. And when the search becomes more formal, when you realize you may be moving from missing to something else, you feel the tone shift. Conversations tighten. Footsteps slow down. People start looking not just for a person, but for signs. A dropped item. A scuffed patch of ground. A place where the pattern of the woods looks slightly wrong. And when the grim discovery is made later that day, the case crosses a line that can't be uncrossed. After that point, every action becomes part of a future explanation. Everything will have to be described, justified, and replayed. Not for television, for court, for families, for the truth. With that shift comes the first big structural decision. You have to secure an area that wasn't secured from the beginning, because no one began the day thinking it would become this. You establish a perimeter. You decide who enters, who exits, who documents. You start thinking about chain of custody, even as the ground under your boots is uneven and damp. You assign someone to photograph, someone to sketch, someone to note where each piece of potential evidence is found and who handled it. Because later, the simplest question will be the hardest one. How do you know? How do you prove? How do you show, step by step, that what you collected is what you say it is? Outdoors, that's never easy. Outdoors is a place that erases things, so you work like someone trying to write in pencil before the rain starts. The recorded phone evidence becomes even more central now. It's handled like something delicate, because it is. Even if the device itself isn't present, the data is, and the data has to be preserved in a way that a defense attorney can't later say was careless. You can picture the quiet process, a technician receiving it, documenting it, making forensic copies, working from duplicates so the original remains untouched. This isn't glamorous work. It's slow, and it's technical, and it matters more than most people ever know. Because one small mistake can turn a powerful clue into an argument. And in a case like Delphi, you don't just need clues, you need clean clues. Word spreads the way it always does. A small town can keep a secret for about as long as it takes to walk across it. Soon, the wider public learns that something happened on a trail that many people have walked. Phones light up, news vehicles arrive, careful but persistent, and the case becomes both local and national, just as the agencies predicted. That brings a different kind of pressure. Tips begin to come in, not just from Delphi, but from everywhere. Some are thoughtful, some are confused. Some are people trying to connect dots that don't belong to the same picture. And still, you can't dismiss any of it quickly, because sometimes the one real detail arrives wrapped in 10 wrong ones. So you begin to build a system for information, a tip line, a set of questions, a way to log each call and mark whether it was checked and by whom. The start of what will become thousands upon thousands of entries, a filing cabinet that grows, not in a room, but in time. Now, the work turns toward building the first timeline, and you can feel how the case file begins to gain weight. It's no longer a single day, it's a sequence of minutes. The afternoon of the 13th of February in 2017, examined from every angle you can manage. Who parked where? Who was on the trail and when? Which car looked out of place? Which person seemed to be walking with purpose? And which person was just out for air? You learn quickly that timeline work is made of ordinary details. A receipt, a text message, a witness who remembers passing someone near a trail sign, a driver who recalls a figure on the roadside. It's all small, and the small things are what you stack into something you can stand on. You begin canvassing, door by door, polite and steady, because you're asking people to remember a day that was, for them, just a day. Some neighbors have cameras, many do not. Some businesses along the routes in and out of Delphi have systems that record over older footage after a short time. So you move quickly but not recklessly. You ask for video. You document what you receive. You note what's missing. And you learn again that time isn't only measured in hours. It's measured in how long a camera keeps its memory. A week, a month, sometimes less. If you arrive too late, the answer has already been taped over by yesterday's ordinary life. That's one of the quiet heartbreaks of modern investigation. So much is recorded, and so much is lost anyway. As witness statements come in, you notice the first frustrating pattern. Descriptions don't align neatly. One person remembers a jacket one way, another remembers it differently. Someone is confident about a hat. Someone else is sure there was no hat at all. Even the age estimates drift. You don't blame them. You've learned that human perception is a gentle, unreliable instrument. Two people can look at the same stranger and walk away with two different portraits. And so, your job becomes less about believing any one statement fully, and more about finding where several statements overlap. The center of gravity. The parts that repeat, the parts that don't. And you keep everything, because today's mismatch might become tomorrow's key. That phone recording sits in the background like a candle in a dark room. Everyone knows it's there, even if few people have heard it directly. The investigators who have access to it treat it with restraint. They don't want to release more than they have to. They don't want the public to shape itself around a single image and miss everything else. But they also know that the person in the recording, whoever he is, may be recognized by someone who doesn't even realize they recognize him. A co-worker, a neighbor, a relative who hears a voice and feels a small, unsettled click of familiarity. So the decision arrives. How much do you share, and when? Transparency can help. Transparency can also distort. Once an image is public, it changes what people think they saw. It can plant details that were never there. So you gather in meetings and you talk through the consequences like grown-ups around a table. You weigh the need for help against the need for purity, and you choose a careful middle. Investigators release a still image first, a man on the bridge, a figure captured in a moment that is both ordinary and suddenly significant. You can picture the way that image travels, printed out, pinned to bulletin boards, shared online, passed from phone to phone with quiet commentary. People lean in, trying to find what's familiar, the shape of the shoulders, the set of the hands, the way the legs are placed mid-step, and then, later, audio is released. A short clip, just enough to make the hair on the back of someone's neck rise. Not in fear, but in recognition. Two simple words, spoken plainly. And with that release, the public is invited into the timeline, not as spectators, but as potential witnesses who might hold one missing piece. The consequence is immediate. The tip line fills. It's not a metaphor, it's calls, emails, messages, and notes arriving faster than a small team can read. And now you face another decision point, one that feels purely logistical but is actually central to the case. Do you prioritize speed, trying to get through everything quickly, or do you prioritize consistency, building a triage system that will still make sense months from now? Because in cases like this, months turn into years. And if you rush now, you may lose the thread later. So you choose structure, you assign categories, you build a database, you create a way to mark tips as checked, pending, or needing follow-up. You set up a routine so that every morning begins the same way, even when the content is chaotic, because routine is how you survive a flood. As the weeks pass, you start to see how an investigation can widen without moving forward. It expands like a circle on a pond. Every tip points outward, every lead asks for another interview, another record request, another drive down a county road to knock on a door, and you begin to understand something that isn't often spoken aloud. Investigative time is a resource. If you spend it on one person, you're not spending it on another. If you send someone to chase a rumor 2 counties away, you're not rechecking a timeline detail that might be closer to home. So you learn to ask, over and over, a quiet question. What does this lead give us? How will we prove it? How does it connect to the known minutes of that afternoon? And when you ask those questions, you start to build a kind of quiet math. Each tip gets weighed against the fixed points you already have, and against what can be checked in the real world. You keep returning to the same anchor points, because anchors are what stop you from drifting. The trailhead, the bridge, the time the girls were dropped off, the window when they were believed to be on the trail, the moment the recording was made. Those aren't just details, they're the frame you hang everything else on. You also learn to treat the absence of information as its own fact. If a person says they were on the trail but no one else saw them, that doesn't prove anything by itself. But it becomes a note you carry forward, a small mark in the margin. And as the case grows, the margins start to fill. One of the first practical tools you reach for is a map that can take notes. Not just a printed map, but one that can layer information. A pin for every witness who says they were at the trail. A pin for every vehicle someone remembers. A pin for every camera you've collected video from, and every camera you wish had existed. Over time, the map becomes less like a picture and more like a living file, and you can stand in front of it and see patterns you wouldn't see in a list. On the Monon High Bridge Trail, a lot of people come and go without leaving a trace. That's normal. So you learn to focus on the people who show up inside the narrow window that matters most. The ones who were close enough in time and space to overlap with the girls. The ones whose stories can be checked against something else, even something as simple as a text message timestamp. That's where patient police work lives, in the places where 2 ordinary records quietly agree with each other. The witness accounts remain difficult, but not useless. You start to separate them into categories. Accounts that include a clear time "I'm sorry, but I cannot assist with that request," stamp, and a location, and at least one other person who can place them there. Those are the statements you can test first. Those are the ones you can tie to the map, and to the known window, and to the practical question of who could have crossed paths with whom. Then there are accounts that are sincere, but softer. A person who thinks they were there but can't remember if it was Monday or Tuesday. Someone who's sure it was the same week, but not sure which day. Those tips don't get thrown away. They get marked differently because they need support before they can carry weight. And then there are the accounts that don't fit at all. A sighting that would require someone to be in two places at once. A memory that describes a coat that wasn't even sold until later. A story that repeats a detail that only became public after the releases. You don't say these people are lying. You just recognize how easily a mind can borrow details when a case becomes part of daily conversation. So you build a practice of asking the same calm follow-up questions. What time did you arrive? Where did you park? Who were you with? What was the weather like? What did you do afterward? And you listen for the small checks that exist inside ordinary life. A receipt, a phone call, a punch in time at work. You also learn to keep a second timeline running alongside the main one, not the timeline of the crime, the timeline of the investigation itself. When a tip was received, when it was assigned, when it was checked, when it was closed, and on what basis. Because if you're still here years from now, you'll need to know what was done and why. And if another detective inherits your file, they'll need to be able to trust the structure. So you build it like a bridge. Simple supports, repeatable steps, a way to cross the same river again without falling in. This is where the case begins to widen into what it will become. A filing cabinet full of names. A list that grows and grows until the list itself needs a system. The first system is usually the simplest one. A way to tag tips by type, witness, vehicle, online message, suspicious person, rumor, a confession claim, a report of someone who suddenly changed behavior. Then a second tag, proximity to Delphi, connection to the trail, connection to the girls, connection to known offenders in the region. The tags don't solve anything, but they let you sort the ocean into buckets. And then comes the work that feels less like chasing and more like staying steady. You start building a picture of who might fit without forcing it. Not a fantasy picture, a practical one. Someone who can be placed in the area. Someone whose movements can overlap the window. Someone who doesn't stand out so much that every witness would remember him clearly, but not so invisible that he leaves no trace at all. You test early theories the way you test a door, gently, without slamming. A local opportunist, someone who knows the trail and knows the quiet places. A traveler passing through who happened to see an opening. Someone who works nearby. Someone who blends into Delphi's ordinary rhythms. You don't commit to one theory too soon. You've seen what happens when a team falls in love with an idea. So you let the ideas sit side by side, and you keep asking the same grounded questions. How would we prove it? What records would exist? What witnesses would exist? What would they have had to do to be there and leave? One of the odd details investigators talk about in cases like this is the balance between planning and plainness. The suspect, whoever he is, seems to move with confidence on that trail, not like someone lost, not like someone uncertain. And at the same time, the outward appearance, based on the image, is plain enough to blend. No bright colors, no obvious markers, just a figure that could be almost anyone in a Midwestern winter. That combination is unsettling, but it's also useful. Confidence suggests familiarity, or at least comfort with the setting. Plainness suggests someone who understands how to disappear into normal life. So you start gathering the names that fit those basic edges. Men with ties to Delphi or the surrounding counties. Men whose work or routines put them in that area. Men with histories that raise concern. And also men with no history at all, because you can't assume the past will announce itself neatly. This is where the case becomes patient and methodical, and sometimes quietly exhausting. Cross-referencing tips against known offender lists, looking at parole records, where legally available, checking employment rosters for jobs that pass through Delphi or near the trail or along the roads that lead away. Asking who had access, who had a reason to be nearby, who had a vehicle matching a vague description. You learn to be careful with vague descriptions, though. A dark jacket on a winter day could describe half the county. A hat or no hat can change depending on angle and memory. So you treat those details like seasoning, not like the meal itself. They can support a conclusion. They can't be the conclusion alone. Interviews begin to fill the days. Some are quick, polite, and clearly unrelated. Some are longer because the person makes you pause, not from fear, but from the sense that you need to be thorough. You ask people about their day, where they were, who can confirm it, what they know about the trail, whether they've ever been on the bridge. You watch body language, yes, but more than that, you watch consistency. A story that stays the same and matches something external tends to be solid. A story that shifts every time you ask it needs more checking. You also start to see the hidden cost of interviews. Every time you sit across from someone, you're also shaping the case. You're giving them a sense of what you care about. You're revealing, in small ways, the outline of what you know. And in a case with national attention, that matters. So you train yourself to ask without giving too much away. You listen more than you speak. You let pauses do work. And when you leave, you write everything down before your memory changes it. Because memory changes, even your own, especially when you're tired and you've been living inside the same hours for weeks. So you create habits. You write notes immediately. You record times. You keep lists of who said what and how confident they were and what they could not remember. You separate facts from impressions. It's not cold. It's respectful. It's how you protect the truth from your own mind. As the suspect pool grows, you start to feel the pressure of opportunity cost more sharply. A lead comes in about a man who resembles the still image. You can't ignore it. But you also can't drop everything every time someone says, "That looks like my cousin." So you build a triage process that's more than just categories. You score tips by checkability. Does it have a name? Does it have a location? Does it have a time frame? Does it come with a photo? Does it come with a vehicle plate? Does it come with a reason? Beyond resemblance. That scoring isn't perfect, but it keeps the work from becoming a swirl. And still, you chase some leads that go nowhere. That's part of it. A person of interest who turns out to be in another state, documented. A rumor that collapses under one request for records. A confession claim that reads like someone trying to borrow attention from grief. You don't get angry about these. You learn to close them cleanly, because clean closures are how you make room for the real thing. Some names, though, don't close so easily. A man who can't quite account for his time. A person whose story is mostly alibi by habit, not by proof. A person whose phone data, if you can get it lawfully, might settle questions either way. In those moments, the case turns toward patience again, because you can't just demand someone's private data without cause. You have to build enough of a foundation to justify the legal steps. And that means collecting small, ordinary supports, statements, work records, vehicle information, the kind of pieces that don't feel dramatic but hold up in court. This is also the era when public messaging becomes its own task, not the press conference moments you see on television. The day-to-day choices. What do you ask the public for? What do you hold back? Do you say you believe the suspect is local? Do you say you believe he's a stranger? Do you risk narrowing the public's imagination too far? Or do you keep it broad and risk drowning in tips? The release of composite sketches becomes part of this balancing act. Investigators work with witnesses, artists, and the difficult reality of memory. A composite isn't a photograph, it's an interpretation of an interpretation. It can help. It can also mislead. And when you issue more than one sketch over time, you have to accept that the public will struggle with it. People want a single face to hold on to. But the file you're holding isn't that simple. In Delphi, the shift from one sketch to another becomes a point of confusion for many. Inside the investigation, it can be a sign of learning, a sign that earlier assumptions are being revisited, a sign that witness input has been reweighed, or a different witness has been prioritized. It's not a failure, it's the slow correction that happens when you keep working. But the community doesn't always feel it that way. The community wants certainty, and you can't give it yet. So you do what careful investigators do. You document why choices were made, which witness contributed what the conditions were, where they stood, how far away, whether they spoke to police immediately or later, after media coverage. You keep these notes because years from now, you'll need to explain the evolution without sounding like you're guessing. Because you're not guessing, you're adjusting based on what you can defend. The suspect picture remains plain on the surface and complicated underneath. A man on a bridge, a voice captured briefly, a few minutes of video that are both priceless and limited, and around that a swirl of human observations. You can feel the case turning into two parallel tracks. One is public, the still image, the audio, the sketches, the requests for tips. The other track is private. Warrants, lab submissions, interviews, evidence inventories, decisions made in quiet rooms, under fluorescent lights. And now, slowly, you reach the part of the work that no one sees. The long months of forensics, lab queues, and waiting. Evidence in a case like this is not a single object you hold up to the light. It's a set of items, a set of samples, a set of digital extracts. Each one gets its own label. Each one gets its own chain of custody. Each one gets sealed, logged, stored, and then, when it's time, each one gets sent in careful steps to a lab. The lab is not a magic room. It's a place with a schedule, a place with backlogs, a place where analysts handle case after case, each one requiring focus. You learn to live with the delays, not because you want to, because you have to. And the waiting becomes its own kind of discipline. You check in, you confirm receipts, you ask about timelines, knowing the answer might not change. You keep the relationship professional and calm, because you're going to need their work to be solid. Some results come back cleanly, and they're helpful. They eliminate people, they confirm that a theory doesn't fit, they tell you, with quiet authority, not that you're right, but that you're wrong. And wrong, in investigation, can be a gift, because it lets you stop walking down a road that doesn't lead anywhere. Other results come back and don't point to a single person. They're partial. They're complex. They're the kind of information that requires another meeting, another consult, another careful read, a mixture, a limitation, a sample that isn't strong enough to be compared the way you'd like. And that's when the case asks you to be mature, to return to basics instead of chasing a shiny new idea. So you go back out to the trail, not for drama, for verification. You re-walk the paths. You check sightlines. You time how long it takes to move from one point to another at a normal pace. You stand where witnesses stood, if they can show you. You look at what they could have seen and what they could not, because an honest witness can still be mistaken if the angle was wrong. You also re-interview, gently. You don't march into a person's home with intensity. You come back with respect and with the understanding that they're tired too. You say, "We're still working. We're checking details. Can you help us clarify something small?" And you ask the same questions again, not because you don't believe them, but because time changes memory. Sometimes a person remembers more later. Sometimes they remember less. Sometimes they remember differently. You document the differences without judgment. This is where objective records become precious. Phone data, when legally obtained, can anchor a person to a location, but only within limits. A phone can be off. A phone can be left behind. A tower can cover a wide area. So you treat it as one piece, not a verdict. You compare it against other things, vehicle sightings, work clocks, video footage. The simple fact of whether a person's story is consistent with geography. Digital evidence review expands, slowly and carefully. The phone recording, the extracted files, the metadata that tells you when something was created. Investigators and analysts look at frames, at audio waveforms, at the small distortions that can suggest distance or movement. They do it with restraint, because it's easy to overinterpret. It's easy to hear what you want to hear, so you bring in more than one set of ears. You ask for independent impressions. You document what's agreed upon and what isn't. Tips also begin to change in flavor over time. Early tips are immediate, raw, and local. Later tips are often influenced by what people have read online or seen in discussions. That doesn't make them worthless, but it means you have to ask, where did you get this information? Did you witness this yourself? Or are you repeating something you heard? And you mark those differences clearly, because you're not only trying to find a suspect, you're trying to build a story that can be proven, step by step. Inside the investigation, there's an internal rhythm that develops, a stretch of activity when a lead comes in that's checkable and everyone moves. Then a stretch of quiet when you're waiting on results, or waiting for a legal process, or simply reviewing what you already have. The quiet stretches aren't vacations, they're paperwork, they're review meetings. They're the slow work of checking that nothing is slipping, because time is always trying to erode the edges of a case. Staff changes happen, people rotate, a detective retires, a new investigator joins. And each time, you have to hand the case over in a way that doesn't lose its shape. So you hold structured case reviews. You sit down with the file, and you ask the same steady questions. What do we know? How do we know it? What have we checked? What remains open? What assumptions are we making that we should challenge? Sometimes in those reviews you discover something small, a lead that was logged but not fully resolved, a name that appears in two different places, filed under two different spellings, a witness statement that was summarized, but the full recording needs to be reheard. It's rarely a lightning bolt. It's more like finding a missing page, and you learn to respect missing pages, because missing pages can change what a paragraph means. There's also the ongoing human work of staying connected to the families and to Delphi. Careful communication, not promises, not false comfort. Just the steady message that the case is being worked, that it hasn't been set aside, that the file is still open on desks, even when the public can't see the daily motion. And you learn that this too is part of investigative integrity, because a community that feels abandoned starts filling the silence with its own stories, and those stories can complicate the work. Years begin to pass in that pattern, and you can feel how time changes the case. The trail remains, the bridge remains, but new seasons cover old tracks again and again. People move, businesses change, phones get replaced, accounts get deleted, and investigators become even more protective of the evidence they do have, because it's now a piece of the past that can't be recreated. When you work a case for years, you also learn how your own mind tries to simplify it. It wants a single explanation, a single suspect, a single mistake that explains everything. But real cases rarely cooperate, so you practice staying open. You keep alternative theories documented, even when one theory feels stronger. You keep lists of what would disprove your leading idea. That isn't doubt for its own sake. It's a guardrail against tunnel vision. And then, after long stretches of lab work and rechecks and steady routine, a decision point begins to form. It doesn't arrive as a trumpet sound. It arrives as a file that has grown thick enough to support a different kind of action. A shift toward courtroom standards. A shift towards steps that you can't take back. Because there's a moment in investigations like this when you stop asking, who might it be? And start asking, can we prove it? Not prove it in a conversation, prove it under rules. Prove it when every step is challenged. Prove it when the defense is allowed to pull apart your work, line by line, in front of a jury. That moment takes years to earn. It requires more than suspicion. It requires alignment. Many modest facts pointing the same direction without forcing them. Movements that make sense with geography. Statements that can be corroborated. Technical data that supports the human accounts within its limitations. And documentation, always documentation, showing that evidence was handled correctly. In Delphi, as the years move forward, investigators continue narrowing. They do it quietly, because they have to. If they move too loudly, they risk contaminating witness memory even more. They risk alerting a suspect if the suspect is still listening. They risk making the case a public argument instead of a legal process. So the narrowing happens behind the scenes. Meetings, legal consults, drafts of affidavits, careful review of what can be sworn to as fact. You can feel the tone shift inside the work. No more loose edges, no more casual notes. Everything begins to be written as if it will be read aloud in a courtroom one day, because it might. So detectives pursue targeted legal steps, search warrants, built on probable cause, not on feelings. Interviews conducted with an awareness of rights and procedure. Evidence collection designed to be repeatable, defensible, and clearly explained. This is where patience turns into precision. A warrant, when you do it right, begins long before a judge ever sees it. It begins with a notebook and a timeline, and the simple promise that you won't exaggerate. You sit with what you can swear to, and you separate it from what you only suspect. You write down where a person was said to be, and you write down how you could know that. You look for the parts of the story that don't rely on anyone's mood or anyone's certainty. A clock in time at work, a card swipe, a camera that caught a car at a stoplight. And you keep reminding yourself that a courtroom doesn't care how strongly you feel. It cares how clearly you can show your steps. In a case like Delphi, you also have to decide what kind of legal move you can justify first. Some steps are small, like asking a phone company to preserve records before they disappear. Other steps are heavier, like asking to search a home, or a vehicle, or a piece of private land. You don't get to do heavy steps just because the community is tired. You do them when the file supports them. And when you finally reach that point, you feel the seriousness settle into the room. Because the moment you act, you create a trail of your own. A trail of paperwork and receipts and photographs. If you make a mistake there, it isn't just embarrassing, it can weaken the whole case later, even if your instinct was right. So you slow down again. You gather with the people who can check you. A prosecutor who asks hard questions. A supervisor who wants every date correct. A technician who will remind you what a lab result can and cannot say. This is the part of the work that can feel almost like writing. Except what you're writing can change someone's life. And it has to be true. It has to be carefully, plainly true. At this stage, investigators also begin thinking about a different kind of timeline. Not only the afternoon on the trail, but the years that followed. If you want to ask for a search, you may need to explain why you believe evidence could still exist. If you want to compare a sample, you have to show how it was collected and how it was stored. The older the case gets, the more you find yourself proving your own care, not just proving a suspect's actions. And Delphi by then is an old case in the public mind. People still talk about it, but the conversation has grooves. Certain names get repeated. Certain theories feel familiar. Online discussions harden into something that sounds like fact, even when it isn't. Inside the investigation, you can't use any of that as your foundation. You need things that exist without opinion. Things you can carry into court with a straight face. So, slowly, you narrow toward the kind of theory that can be tested. Not a theory that makes sense in a late-night conversation. A theory that can survive cross-examination. In Delphi, that kind of theory was never going to be one single dramatic clue. It was going to be an alignment. Many modest facts, sitting side by side, pointing in one direction. And that alignment takes time, because each modest fact has to be cleaned. Each one has to be checked for alternate explanations. Each one has to be documented in a way another person can follow. You can picture an investigator laying pieces out on a table. A statement here, a receipt there, a map, a list of vehicles, a lab report, a timeline. Not like a movie where the answer appears in an instant, more like careful bookkeeping, where you notice one column doesn't add up. One small inconsistency that won't leave you alone. And in cases that last years, you also learn that people change their stories for ordinary reasons. They forget. They confuse days. They don't want to admit they were somewhere they shouldn't have been, even if it's unrelated. So you keep going back to the same gentle questions. Where were you, and how do you know? Who can confirm it without being asked to guess? What record might exist? And, quietly, you ask another question too. If this person is involved, what would we expect to see afterward? Not in their emotions, because emotions are messy. In their practical world, a phone that went dark, a car that was cleaned, a sudden change in routine, a statement that seems designed to get ahead of a question. Those are delicate observations. You don't treat them as proof. You treat them as prompts, guiding what you check next. And if you are lucky, sometimes a prompt leads to something solid, a record, a timestamp, a witness who can place a car at a certain spot, a small thing that doesn't care what anyone believes. Over time, the investigation also becomes more selective about who is allowed to see what. That isn't secrecy for the thrill of it. It's to preserve later testimony. If too many details leak, you can't tell whether a confession is real or borrowed. If too many details circulate, you can't tell whether a witness remembers or repeats. So, information is handled like evidence too, shared only when it serves a purpose, and logged when it's shared because everything becomes part of the record. When you finally move toward a targeted search, the planning looks almost gentle. A list of what you are allowed to take, a plan for photographing before touching anything, a plan for packaging, labeling, sealing, a plan for where each item will go afterward, and who will be responsible. You also plan for the human side. Who will be present? Who will speak, if anyone speaks? Who will handle any interaction with neighbors, with the media, with family members? Because a search isn't only a technical event. It's a moment in a community. And in Delphi, the community has been holding its breath for a long time. There's another quiet reality you learn here. If you search and find nothing, you may have educated a suspect. You may have told them what you care about. You may have pushed evidence farther away. So you don't search because you hope. You search because you have a reason to believe something will be there, or that the act of searching will produce lawful comparisons. That can mean collecting items that are not dramatic. Clothing, boots, tools, digital devices taken carefully with proper authority, then imaged by specialists. And sometimes it means collecting a sample for comparison. A sample that by itself says nothing to the public. But to an investigator, it's a key that might fit, or might not. And if it doesn't fit, that matters too. It's one more door you can close cleanly. In the Delphi case, the long years eventually did produce that sort of turning point. An arrest made after patience, made after records, made after years of narrowing. You can imagine the strange quiet in the hours before it happens. Briefings that are factual, not emotional. People checking their equipment. A prosecutor reviewing language again. A detective reading a timeline one more time just to make sure the order is right. Because once you arrest someone, the case changes shape. It stops being a search in the abstract. It becomes a test of one central allegation, and that is a different kind of responsibility. When an arrest comes years later, the public often experiences it like a switch being flipped. Before the case was open, floating. Now it feels decided. But inside the work, it's almost the opposite. The arrest is not the end of investigating, it's the beginning of proving. And proving is slower than people expect. Because now, every step you take will be scrutinized by a defense team whose job is to find weaknesses. Not because they love the case or hate the victims, because the system requires testing. It requires someone to push back. So you prepare for that pushback by doing the work twice. You check your own chain of custody again. You reread old reports looking for any line that could be misunderstood. You listen to old interviews, hearing them with new ears. You ask yourself whether a witness's wording could be challenged, whether a date could be misread, whether a note could be interpreted as an assumption instead of an observation. This is where the investigation becomes almost archival. You become a person protecting paper and memory and procedure. You are not only catching a suspect, you are protecting the integrity of years of work. And there's another careful discipline here. You continue to test alternate explanations even after an arrest. That can sound strange to the public who wants certainty, but it's how you avoid tunnel vision. It's how you make sure you didn't miss someone else or misread a detail just because you finally have a name. So you keep an open list. What would contradict our theory? What evidence could exclude this person? What witness could place them elsewhere with support? And if you find something that challenges you, you don't hide it. You document it. You resolve it if you can. Or you acknowledge it honestly if you can't. Because honesty is the only thing that survives court. In the years between the crime and an arrest, witnesses have lived whole lives. They've changed jobs. They've moved homes. They've told the story to friends, then stopped telling it. Some have tried to forget the day entirely, so when you return to them now, you do it softly. You don't demand. You ask. You say, "We need to make sure we have this right. We need to make sure we don't put words in your mouth." And you learn quickly that some people are afraid of being wrong, not because they want to mislead you, because they know the stakes now. So you give them space to say, "I don't remember," and you treat that as a valid answer, not a failure. Then you look for support, old messages, photos from that day that might have an invisible timestamp, a social media post that was made before anyone knew it mattered. These are the small archives of ordinary life. And in long investigations, ordinary life becomes evidence. You also look back at your public releases with new caution, the still image, the short audio, the sketches. Each release helped bring in tips, and each release also shaped memory. Now you have to anticipate questions about that. A defense attorney may ask, could a witness have been influenced? Could they be describing the released image instead of their own experience? So you compare early statements to later ones. You look for what the witness said before they saw the public material. You look for the parts that stayed consistent. And you mark where things changed, not to accuse the witness, to understand how time and information interacted. This is the kind of work people don't imagine when they think about detectives. They imagine chasing, but here you're mostly reading, listening, sorting, trying to make sure the story you present is the story you can prove. If you're sitting with the file late at night, in a quiet office, you might notice how many voices live inside it. An officer's report, written in a hurry in the first week. A lab analyst's careful language, cautious and precise. A witness statement, raw and human. A dispatch log. A search log from the first night, names and times and routes. All of it has to become one coherent narrative. Not a perfect narrative, a truthful one. And when prosecutors begin preparing discovery, another kind of patience arrives. Discovery is not storytelling, it's exposure. It's the process of turning over what exists so the defense can examine it. That means the file has to be organized in a way that withstands daylight. No missing pages, no mystery gaps, no unlabeled photographs. It's tedious, and it's essential, because the quickest way to damage a case is to look sloppy. Even if your heart is in the right place, even if you worked hard, sloppy is something a courtroom punishes. So you prepare like a librarian as much as a detective. You check that each piece of evidence has a matching log entry. You confirm the transfers are signed. You ensure the digital evidence has hash values documented so it can be shown unchanged. These are technical terms, but the idea is simple. You are proving that what you have now is what you had then, that nothing was altered, that nothing was lost. And if something was lost, that it is documented as lost and why. Sometimes in these later stages, you discover small administrative issues. A label that uses one spelling in one place and another spelling elsewhere. A date typed incorrectly, then corrected later. A photograph whose timestamp reflects a camera setting, not real time. These are the kinds of problems that don't change truth, but can confuse a jury. So you resolve them now, with calm explanations and supporting records. You don't hide imperfections, you contextualize them, because perfection is not the standard, transparency is. While all of this is happening, the community continues living around the file. In Delphi, people still walk past the trailhead. They drive the roads in and out of town. They pass the bridge in their minds, even if they never go there again. And every time there's news, even small news, it stirs grief. It stirs debate. It stirs questions that have waited for years. As an investigator, you feel that pressure without letting it steer you, because you've learned that community pressure is like weather. It's real. It affects visibility, but it can't change your route. Your route is evidence and procedure and proof. With an arrest, there is also the question of what to say and what not to say. The public wants details. They want to know what finally led to this moment. But legal strategy and fairness require restraint. You may be limited by court orders. You may be limited by the simple fact that you don't want to taint a jury pool. So information tightens. Press conferences become carefully worded. Statements become shorter. And the case, which once felt like a shared community project, becomes quieter again. Not because anyone stopped caring, because now the system is moving in a different lane, and the lane has rules. Inside the investigation team, this is when you begin prepping for hearings. You prepare to explain probable cause. You prepare to defend the way evidence was collected. You prepare for questions about the phone recording, how it was obtained, how it was preserved, who had access, how you can show it's authentic. You also prepare to speak about what you did not do, because in long cases, there are always roads not taken. The defense may ask why you focused on one suspect when others existed. They may ask why a tip was not pursued sooner. They may ask why a search did not happen in the first month or the first year. Sure, you prepare those answers with the same calm tone you used at the start. You explain resources, legal thresholds, the fact that you cannot search without cause, and you cannot manufacture cause from community desire. And then there are the witnesses. Witnesses are not just people who saw someone. They can be people who remember a small, ordinary interaction. A man at a store, a person seen on a road, a vehicle parked strangely. Over years, those memories become delicate. So, when you prepare witnesses, you do it with care. You don't tell them what to say. You remind them what they said before. You show them their own statement, and you ask if it remains accurate. You encourage them to be honest about uncertainty, because a witness who admits what they do not know is often more believable than one who insists. And you also have to accept a quiet truth. Some witnesses will not be as strong as they once were. Some will be gone from the area entirely, and you'll have to find them gently through old addresses and forwarding trails. Some will answer the phone and go quiet because the case still lives in their chest. Some will want to help, but you'll hear the hesitation in their voice when you ask about times and clothing. In those moments, you learn to let the records do as much work as they can. You pull the original tip sheets. You pull the first interview recordings. You compare the first version of a memory to the version that came after years of news coverage. Not to scold anyone, just to understand what is stable and what has shifted. The stable things become your backbone, a timestamp that doesn't depend on recall, a photograph that was taken that day for an unrelated reason, a phone call log that places someone driving a certain road at a certain hour. You start building a witness packet that isn't about persuasion, it's about clarity. You want each witness to stand on the ground they truly remember, and not on the ground the internet built for them. And still, you accept that some witnesses will come to the edge of a detail and stop. They'll say, "I'm not sure," or "I don't want to guess." And you'll thank them for that, because a courtroom can feel the difference between certainty and bravery. Sometimes the strongest contribution a person can make is to refuse to fill in blank space. As you gather these refreshed statements, you also begin a quiet audit of your own old assumptions. You look back at what you once treated as likely. You ask whether you can still defend it. You ask whether the sequence of the afternoon, the order of sightings, still holds when you remove the shaky parts. That's a humbling exercise. It can feel like pulling a thread out of a sweater you've worn for years, wondering what might loosen. But it's also how you keep the file honest. In a case that took years, the legal standard becomes a kind of metronome. Not fast, not loud, just steady. If you can't show it, you don't lean on it. If you can show it, you show it with a straight face, and you do it the same way every time. And now the case has crossed into a new phase where you're not only investigating, you're also translating. You're taking years of notes and turning them into something another person can follow. A prosecutor needs that translation. A judge needs it. And eventually a jury will need it too. So you begin building what amounts to a master narrative, anchored to exhibits, exhibit numbers, dates, chain of custody lines. You learn to love the plainness of that structure because plainness survives scrutiny. This is also when the smallest administrative choices begin to matter again. A file name on a digital extraction, the way an audio clip was stored, who had the password, and when it changed, when a copy was made, and who verified the hash value matched. These details can feel far away from the trail, but they're the path the evidence takes through time, and the path has to be clean. If you're sitting at a desk late in the evening, you can almost see the long hallway of the investigation behind you, the first night's search log, the early canvas notes, the thousands of tips, each one a tiny door that had to be checked. Then lab submissions, and returns, and rechecks. Then the shift into targeted steps, and legal documents, and warrants. And now, the slow stacking of everything into a shape that can stand in court. It's tiring in a particular way, not like running, like carrying. There's a quiet shift in how you speak, too. In the early months, you might have said, "We think." Now you say, "We observed. We documented. We recovered." You don't do that to sound cold. You do it because language is a tool. And in court, words get weighed. A single loose verb can become a crack. So you choose your verbs like you're choosing bricks. When you return to the digital evidence, especially the phone recording, you treat it like its own small case within the case. You review who first received it, how it was extracted, whether it was handled directly on the device or through an image, what software was used, whether the extraction was repeated later with improved tools, and if so, how those outputs compare. Digital forensics has a way of changing over time, and a long investigation has to admit that. Sometimes later tools pull data earlier tools couldn't. Sometimes they clarify metadata. Sometimes they simply confirm what you already had, which is useful too. But you never want the defense to be the first person to point out an upgrade. You want to be able to say, "Yes, we revisited this, and here's why, and here's how we kept it consistent." You document your reasons. You document your process. And you keep old copies preserved, so no one can claim the original was overwritten by enthusiasm. The same is true for lab work. Over years, labs change methods, standards improve, databases expand. And if there's any piece of evidence that can be re-examined under newer standards, the temptation is to do it immediately. But you don't do things because you're tempted. You do them because you can justify them, So you hold meetings where you ask simple questions. What could be gained? What could be lost? What would it cost in time and lab priority? And what would it mean if results come back inconclusive again? Because inconclusive is not nothing. Inconclusive is a weight you still have to carry. It can't be made into certainty. It can only be explained as limitation, and limitation is part of the truth. As the case tightens around courtroom standards, the team also becomes more careful about internal access. Not everyone sees everything. That can be hard, because trust is important inside a unit. But this kind of compartmentalization is another form of evidence preservation. Fewer hands, fewer accidental comments, fewer chances for a detail to drift out into the world before it belongs there. And it protects witnesses too, because witnesses are human, and humans talk when they're anxious. There's also the quiet work of managing expectations, families, community members, even officers who aren't assigned to the case, but feel it anyway. People ask questions in grocery store aisles, they ask in parking lots, they ask at school events, and you learn to answer in a way that doesn't wound. You keep your voice calm, you say you can't discuss active proceedings, you say the process is slow, and it has to be. You don't offer hints, you don't offer comfort shaped like secrets, you offer steadiness. Inside the courthouse rhythm, everything becomes calendar driven. Deadlines, motions, hearings, orders. Each one changes what you can do and what you can say. You start living by reminders and checklists, not because you want your life to be that way, because missing a deadline can mean delaying the truth, and delay is another kind of harm. So you build redundancy. Someone else checks your work, someone else confirms the exhibit list, someone else verifies that an evidence package is sealed, labeled, and signed. And then there's the quiet weight of discovery itself. The simple fact that you will be handing years of work to a defense team trained to question it. You don't take that personally. You can't. If you take it personally, you start protecting your pride instead of protecting the case. So you practice a kind of emotional neutrality. You tell yourself, their job is to test. My job is to have done the work in a way that passes a test. Sometimes that means revisiting decisions from the earliest days, the ones you made when you didn't know what the case would become. Why certain areas were searched first, why certain volunteers were allowed in before the scene changed status, why a perimeter was established where it was, and when. You pull the dispatch logs. You pull weather records. You pull the names of first responders and search coordinators. You interview your own people, gently, the way you interview witnesses, because time affects everyone, and you document their recollections against the objective logs that still exist. It's strange, in a way, to re-interview your own team, but in a long case, it's necessary. A defense attorney will ask. A judge may ask, so you make sure you can answer without scrambling. You make sure the story of the investigation is as carefully handled as the story of the day on the trail. You also begin building what investigators sometimes call the elimination record. Not just who you suspect, who you cleared, and how. It's less glamorous than naming a target, but it's vital. Because a jury may wonder, what about that other man? What about the one people talked about online? What about the rumor that spread in year 2, then again in year 5? If you can show, calmly, that those roads were walked, and where they ended, you build confidence without ever raising your voice. And sometimes those eliminations are simple. A person was not in the state. A person's phone records and work records put them elsewhere. A person's appearance was similar, but the timeline doesn't allow it. Other eliminations are more complex, and you have to explain them without drowning anyone in detail. You learn to summarize with integrity. You learn to say, we checked this, and here's the reason it doesn't fit, and here's the document that supports that. All of this preparation changes the way the case feels day to day. In the first year it was motion, calls, searches, canvassing. Now it's often stillness, stacks of paper, long review sessions, quiet conversations with prosecutors, small corrections that take hours, because accuracy is now the highest form of speed. And there's a personal side to that stillness. If you've worked the case for a long time, it becomes part of your identity. You might not talk about it at dinner, but it's there, a file you carry in your head, a set of images you wish you could unsee, even if you never described them. You learn to live with the weight without letting it harden you. And some nights, when the building is quiet, you let yourself feel the human reason you're doing all this. Not rage, not drama, just the steady wish for answers that can hold up. As proceedings move forward, you also start preparing for what happens if evidence gets challenged. A motion to suppress, an argument about a search warrant's basis, a question about whether a statement was voluntary. These are not side issues, they're the gatekeepers. If a judge decides something was gathered improperly, it might not reach a jury at all. So you rehearse your steps. You trace your own path. You make sure each link in the chain can be explained by the person who made it. That's one reason good investigations are built on teams. Because one person can't be everywhere. One person can't remember everything. But a team with proper logs can become a single reliable memory. So you gather the right people, the evidence custodian, the digital forensics examiner, the officer who wrote the first report, the person who supervised a search, and you walk through what they did, slowly, until each part is clear enough to be spoken. When you reach a hearing, it doesn't feel like a climax. It feels like a test you studied for, while knowing the questions will still surprise you. You sit in a room with wood and microphones, and you listen. You watch the judge's face. You watch the way attorneys choose words. You see how every sentence gets shaped into an argument. And through all of that, you try to keep the case itself at the center. Not your ego, not the public's appetite, just the facts you can support. Outside the courtroom, the town continues. That's one of the quietest, strangest parts of a high-profile case. The grocery store still opens. The school buses still run. The post office still sorts mail. And at the same time, a famous file is being carried in boxes into buildings for proceedings that may last all day. People in Delphi may not know what was said in court that morning, but they feel that something is happening. They feel it in the way cars are parked. They feel it in the way conversations pause when someone new walks into a diner. The investigation team has to live in both worlds, the world of strict legal rules and the world of human community. And you learn that you don't serve the community by feeding it scraps of rumor. You serve it by doing the work correctly, even when correctness looks like silence. Even when correctness looks like waiting, part of that waiting is the slow calendar of pretrial motions. Sometimes a hearing gets rescheduled, sometimes a filing deadline moves. Sometimes an order comes down that changes what can be discussed, and you adjust. You take a breath. You rewrite your plan. You continue. A long case teaches you that setbacks aren't always dramatic. Sometimes a setback is a single page missing from an old report, and the hours it takes to find it. Sometimes it's a witness who can no longer be located. Sometimes it's a technology question, a file format, an old phone extraction that has to be interpreted for people who don't live in that world. And when you hit those slower setbacks, you handle them the same way you handled the first wave of tips. You build a system. You assign tasks. You document outcomes. If a witness can't be located, you document your efforts. If a record no longer exists, you document why. If a camera overwrote footage years ago, you document that you attempted to obtain it and it was unavailable. In court, honesty about absence can matter as much as presence. It shows you didn't ignore holes. It shows you found them and you named them. There's another careful, private task that happens in this phase. You begin to think about what can be shown visually to a jury. Maps, timelines, photographs of locations, diagrams, not to shock anyone, to orient them, because most jurors have never been to the Monon High Bridge Trail. They don't know the distance between the trailhead and the bridge. They don't know where the private properties lie and how the terrain moves. So you create exhibits that teach without persuading. You keep them plain. You label them clearly. You make sure every measurement can be explained. And you practice telling the story in a way that respects attention span. A long investigation can produce a mountain of detail, but a jury can only hold so much at once. So you learn to choose, not what is true, what is necessary. You keep the rest available in case it's needed, but you don't dump it onto people. You present the backbone first, then the supports, then the confirmations. You tell it like a careful walk, step by step. One thing you learn, if you stay in the work long enough, is that court is often about teaching, not performing. Teaching 12 strangers what you did, and why you did it, and how you avoided mistakes. Teaching them what a timeline is, and what it isn't. Teaching them how digital metadata can help, and where it can mislead. Teaching them why a witness might be certain about one detail and uncertain about another. In that sense, the patient investigative mindset belongs in court too. It's the same calm you used at the beginning, just with more paperwork. Now and then you'll feel the urge to rush, a human urge. You'll think about the years that passed and how much everyone wants a resolution. And you'll have to remind yourself that rushing now would be the cruelest thing, because rushing now could break what was built. So you return to your checklists. You return to your logs. You return to your habit of asking, can I prove this sentence? If I can't, I rewrite it. This phase also brings a different kind of media pressure, not the early scramble for basic facts. Now, every filing becomes a story. Every hearing becomes a headline. And the public, having waited so long, reads every line as if it contains hidden meaning. You can't control that. You can only control your own discipline. You keep your team focused. You remind them not to read comments. You remind them not to argue online. You keep the work inside the file, where it belongs. There's a quiet irony here. The case began outdoors, in a place where everything changes with wind and weather. Now much of the case is indoors, where the environment is controlled. But the human element is still the wildest factor. People mishear. People misunderstand. People want certainty so badly that they invent it. So you keep returning to what doesn't change. The chain of custody log, the dispatch record, the timestamp, the original statement, the raw digital file, the parts that can be checked by anyone who takes the time. And even as proceedings continue, cold case habits remain. You keep an alternative lead list, updated and dated. You keep notes about tips that came in late, even after an arrest, because late tips still need to be evaluated. Most will be noise. Some might be misunderstandings. But you don't decide in advance. You triage. You check what can be checked. You document what you did. That way, if anyone ever asks, you can say, yes, we continue to investigate with open eyes. You also continue to re-examine the physical geography, the trail, the access points, the roads leading away. In the years after, the landscape may have changed slightly. A tree line trimmed, a path altered, a sign moved. So you preserve the older photographs and maps and you make note of changes. You may bring in people who can speak to what the area looked like then. A parks employee, a long-time resident, someone who took photos there in winter around that time. Because small environmental changes can affect how a jury understands movement and visibility. And this work, too, is patient. You're not trying to create a perfect replica of the past. You're trying to avoid misleading anyone about it. You want to be able to say, this is what it was, as best as we can show. This is what changed. And here's how we know. As time moves, you may find yourself revisiting one of the most delicate elements of the case, the audio. A short clip can carry enormous weight in the public imagination, but in court, audio is complicated. How clear is it? What can truly be heard? What is interpretation? What is suggestion? So you prepare for that carefully. You consider whether enhancements were used, and how. You document every step of any processing, and you keep the unaltered original ready for comparison. You consult experts who can explain plainly what enhancement can do and what it cannot. And then you do something that can feel almost too simple. You listen again in silence, not for a dramatic reaction, for accuracy, for what is actually there. You accept that people will hear different things. You accept that the mind fills in gaps, and you design your approach around that truth, rather than pretending it isn't real. This period can feel like the case is moving, but also not moving. The public sees headlines and court dates, then long stretches of nothing. Inside, there is plenty of work. A lot of that work is simply making sure you can find things again. You open a digital folder, and you want the same file to be there tomorrow and next month and next year. You open a physical binder, and you want every tab to match what the index says it holds. You want the case to be navigable, even by someone who didn't live through the first week. One practical step is to build a master inventory that isn't tied to any one person's memory. You list every report, every recording, every photograph, every lab submission, every return. You add dates, initials, and the place each item lives, both physically and digitally. You add notes about the format, because formats age, and old files can become hard to open. And when you do it right, the inventory becomes its own kind of calm. Because when you're under courtroom pressure, you don't want to hunt. You don't want to say, I think it's in the other box. You want to say, it's item number this, stored here, sealed on this date, opened only by these people. That kind of specificity doesn't make a case true, but it makes a true case easier to show. Another quiet task is preparing the people who will testify, not about what happened, but about how the work was done. The evidence custodian may have to explain the evidence room. The digital examiner may have to explain what a forensic image is and why it matters. A search team leader may have to explain how zones were assigned and how logs were kept. These are ordinary procedures, but in court, they become story. And story here means sequence, not drama. So you sit with each person and you walk through their own paperwork with them. You ask them to read their report as if they've never seen it before. You ask them where the report came from, what notes they used, and what they remember beyond what's written. You remind them not to guess. You remind them that it's okay to say, I don't recall, and then to rely on the document. Because a witness who stays inside the lines is a witness the jury can trust. This is also when you become careful about the difference between refreshing memory and shaping memory. If a person wrote a report years ago, you can show them the report. You can ask whether it's accurate, whether it reflects what they knew then, but you don't want to practice lines. You don't want to turn testimony into a performance. You want the plain truth, and you want it to be repeatable. Repeatable is a word you start to love in long investigations. If you extracted a phone once, can you explain the process so another examiner could do it the same way? If you photographed an item, can you show where you stood, how you labeled it, how the file was stored? If you took a statement, can you show the recording, the transcription, and the time it was made? Repeatable means the work isn't magic. Repeatable means the work can be checked. Sometimes, as you prepare, you notice how much of the case depends on small decisions made under stress. The choice to log volunteers on the first night, the choice to limit access when it became clear the scene needed control, the choice to preserve the original digital files and work only from copies. In court, those choices look wise. In real time, they were simply the best decisions people could make with limited information. So you don't romanticize them, you just document them, and you explain them like a person who respects reality. And then there's the issue of the community's memory. In Delphi, people have spent years talking about the bridge, the trail, the image, the audio. They've filled in gaps with conversation, sometimes without meaning to. So when you think about testimony, you also think about contamination, not as an accusation, but as a human condition. A person can come to believe they saw something because they've heard it described so many times. A person can change the color of a jacket in their mind because they've seen the still image too often. To handle that, you lean hard on early statements. The first interview, the first email, the first tip line call. You look at what a person said before the case became a national story. You compare it to later versions. If the course stays the same, you breathe a little easier. If the story has grown extra details, you make a note and you tread carefully. And you also remember quietly that witnesses are not tools. They're residents and hikers and drivers and people who went to work that day. They didn't ask to become part of a famous file, so you give them room to be human. You schedule interviews around their jobs, their kids, their health. You keep your voice even, and you thank them for time they can't get back. As this phase goes on, you may find that the hardest questions aren't about the day of the crime, they're about the years in between. Why didn't this lead turn into a warrant earlier? Why did it take so long to narrow? Why did the public hear one thing, then another? Those questions can feel sharp, but they're not always hostile. Sometimes they're just the sound of people trying to make time feel fair. In response, the team has to explain the simplest truth about long investigations. Information arrives unevenly. Technology changes. Legal thresholds matter. A tip without a name can't be subpoenaed into becoming a name. A suspicion without corroboration can't become a search, no matter how badly the town wants it. So you keep coming back to what you could do, when you could do it, and why. You also revisit the tip database with a different purpose now. In the early years, the goal was to find possibilities. Now the goal becomes to show the route you took through those possibilities. That means printing audit trails and preserving notes about decisions. It means showing that tips were handled consistently and not cherry-picked. It means being able to say, we did not ignore this category. We did not ignore this time frame. Sometimes you find that a tip was closed in a way that made sense at the time, but reads differently now. Not because it was wrong, but because later information changed the context. So, you document that too. You say, at the time, we did not have this detail, and we couldn't legally obtain that record yet. And you show the steps you took once the foundation existed. There's also the quiet work of protecting sensitive details that still aren't public. In a case like Delphi, some facts are held back for good reasons. They help distinguish genuine knowledge from rumor. They protect dignity. They keep the proceedings from turning into public entertainment. So you learn to speak in two layers. One layer is what the public can know. The other layer is what the court will manage carefully when the time comes. That can be uncomfortable because secrecy can look like indifference. But you keep reminding yourself that this isn't secrecy, it's stewardship. It's holding information until it can be used properly, under rules, with safeguards. And while all of that is happening, the case keeps generating small, practical needs. A map has to be updated with the correct scale. A photograph has to be matched to its original file path. A piece of audio has to be verified against the unprocessed original, so you can explain what was done. A timeline chart has to be checked for one small transcription error that could confuse a juror. These are small things, but small things are where court cases live. You start to see the case like a long bridge made of tiny fasteners. Most people only look at the span, but the strength is in the bolts, so you check the bolts. You check them again. If you've ever worked inside a courthouse schedule, you know how much waiting happens in plain sight. A hearing starts late, a motion is argued, then taken under advisement. A ruling comes days later or weeks later, and during that time you keep working because you can't pause the rest of the preparation. You keep assembling exhibits, you keep updating witness contact information, you keep coordinating with labs and experts, so everyone is ready when a date is set. That coordination becomes its own kind of investigation, not into guilt or innocence, but into logistics. Who is available to testify on which day? How long will it take to transport evidence properly? What accommodations will a witness need if they're traveling or if they have health limitations? How do you present digital evidence in a courtroom without risking alteration or confusion? The case becomes both human and procedural, again. And then there are the moments when something unexpected happens, not in the facts, but in the process. A filing might raise a question about whether a particular piece of evidence is admissible. An attorney might request additional testing. A judge might set boundaries on what can be said publicly. or how certain material can be handled. None of that feels like a twist. It feels like the system doing what it does, slowly. Still, each procedural shift creates work. If an additional test is ordered, you may have to locate the item again, check seals, document the transfer, arrange transport. You may have to wait in another lab queue, because labs have their own schedules. And you have to be careful that new testing doesn't consume the only sample, or alter something in a way the defense can challenge. So you consult, you plan, you document. Always document. Sometimes the work is less about new information and more about reframing. You realize that a detail you've known for years needs to be explained in simpler language. Not because the jury isn't smart, because they weren't there. They don't know the terrain, the weather, the distance, the way time feels on a trail. So you practice explaining without jargon. You practice saying, this is where this was located, and this is how far it is from that. You practice describing the difference between a phone connecting to a tower and a phone being held in a hand. You practice saying, this tool can narrow, but it cannot pinpoint. And you do that practice with humility, because it's easy to sound certain when you're fluent. Court asks you to be fluent and careful at the same time. It asks you to respect what the tools can do and what they can't. That respect becomes part of your credibility. There is also, in long cases, the matter of staff continuity. A detective who did early interviews might not be on the team anymore. A technician might have moved to another unit. A prosecutor might change. So you track down the right people and you preserve their knowledge while you still can. Sometimes that means recording a detailed statement from a retired officer about what they did and why. Sometimes it means locating old notes that were stored under an outdated case number. Sometimes it means admitting that a person's memory has faded and relying more heavily on their written report. It's not a failure, it's time being time. And the only antidote is careful record keeping, which is why those early logs matter so much. As you move through this phase, you also become aware of how a case like Delphi sits inside the larger history of investigative work. You think about other cases that lasted years, where one overlooked detail became important only later. You think about how evidence can wait quietly for technology to catch up. You think about how a name can sit in a file for months before the right comparison is made. Those thoughts don't solve anything by themselves, but they remind you that waiting isn't always passive. Waiting can be active if you're preserving and preparing. That mindset helps you handle the long stretches where the public sees silence, because silence, inside the file, is often full of motion. Phone calls, emails to experts, evidence transfers, proofreading exhibit lists, re-listening to recorded interviews with headphones on, taking notes like a student. You're not chasing through streets. You're building a record that can survive. One of the hardest practical pieces is deciding what not to include in the main courtroom narrative. You may have hundreds of tips that were sincere and wrong. You may have persons of interest who were looked at carefully and eliminated. You may have side stories that the public has obsessed over for years. But in court, you don't get to litigate the entire internet. You have to keep focus. So you create layers. The core timeline, the core evidence, the core witness set. Then a supporting layer, available if challenged. Then a deep archive, where everything is stored, preserved, and searchable, but not dumped into the room. That layering is another act of respect. It respects the jury's attention. It respects the families, who deserve clarity rather than chaos. It respects the truth, because truth doesn't need every rumor attached to it. In this stage, you also watch how people around you cope. Some investigators become very quiet. Some become intensely organized, making lists for their lists. Some crack their knuckles and ask for one more check, just to feel useful. You notice the small rituals, the same coffee cup, the same chair, the way someone always reads the last page of a report first, out of habit. These are human comforts in a process that can feel impersonal. And you let people have those comforts as long as they don't distort the work. Because the work is heavy. Not because it's dramatic, but because it asks you to hold years in your hands. There's a moment, sometimes, when you return to the original scene photos, not to study them for new clues, but to remind yourself of the responsibility. Not to stir yourself up, just to center. You look at the trail, the bridge, the winter trees. You remember that this is a real place where people used to walk for fresh air. You remember that your job is to speak for what can't speak for itself, and then you go back to your checklist. In preparation for trial, you also have to think about sequencing exhibits in a way that doesn't confuse. If the jury sees a map before they know the names, it's just lines. If they hear audio before they understand context, it becomes a blank screen they project onto. So you plan the order like a gentle lesson. Place first, then time, then the people who were present, then the records that anchor those people, then the technical evidence, carefully explained. And you keep reminding yourself to avoid overreach. Overreach can be subtle, a sentence that implies more than it proves, a phrase that sounds like certainty when it's actually inference. So you write and rewrite and have other eyes review it. A good team will catch you when you drift. They'll say, "Can we really say that, or should we say this instead?" And you'll listen, because pride has no place here. The other side of the case, the human side, continues to unfold in Delphi itself. People attend hearings when they can. People talk quietly in parking lots, then stop when someone unfamiliar approaches. A town learns, over years, to hold grief in a public way, and that changes a place. It changes how strangers are received. It changes how a trail feels. It changes how a winter afternoon sits in memory. As an investigator, you can't fix that, but you can avoid making it worse. You can show steadiness. You can avoid theatrics. You can treat every public moment as a moment that will echo, because in a small town, echoes last. And as the calendar advances, you may feel the case narrowing again, but this time it's not narrowing toward a suspect. It's narrowing toward a set of questions the court will decide. What evidence will be allowed? What testimony will be limited? What procedures will be examined in detail? Those questions shape how you prepare. They shape what experts you call. They shape what you practice explaining again and again. It can feel strange, because the heart of the case is simple. Two girls went out for a walk and didn't come home. But the legal mechanism built around that simple truth is complex, because it must be fair. And fairness in a system like this is built out of procedure. Procedure is the language the court speaks. So you learn to speak it fluently, without forgetting why you're there. Sometimes, right in the middle of this procedural stretch, a small administrative development forces another round of careful checking, a new protective order, a new sealing decision, a new schedule for filings. And each one affects how evidence is stored and shared, who can view certain material, where it can be kept, how it can be transported, whether it can be discussed in open court or only under certain conditions. These aren't dramatic questions. They're custodial questions, but they matter because they protect integrity. And if you're the person holding the file, you start thinking like an archivist again. Not just, what do we have? But, what are we allowed to do with what we have right now? You check. You confirm. You avoid assumptions. Because assumptions are where mistakes are born. In the background, you continue to treat late arriving tips the same way you treated the first wave. Log them. Assess them. Check what can be checked. Most will not change the path. But you don't get to decide that without looking. So you assign someone to review, to cross-reference, to document. And you keep that record, because someday a juror or an appellate court might ask whether the investigation stayed open-minded. Open-minded does not mean scattered. It means disciplined enough to consider and disciplined enough to close. That's the balance you're always chasing. As you move through these weeks and months, you begin to sense the approach of the next shift. Not a conclusion, not an ending, just a shift in where the weight sits. The file is no longer only something you work on, it's something you live with. It travels with you in the way you think about time and process and how memory can blur. It changes how you walk into a room full of paperwork. It changes how you speak to a witness who apologizes for not remembering. And it changes how you look at Delphi itself. Not as a headline, not as a symbol, but as a town that has had to carry a question for a long time. A town that keeps mowing lawns and hosting school games while also keeping 2 empty seats in its mind. Soon, the focus will turn even more toward that town's long after, toward how people endure the waiting and how investigators keep their habits steady even when the case is no longer technically cold, toward the way uncertainty lingers at the edges, even as the court process moves forward in its slow, deliberate way. But before you step fully into that wider reflection, there's still one more round of very practical work waiting on the desk. There are witness lists to finalize, exhibit binders to double-check, and decisions to make about how to explain the timeline without overwhelming anyone. And in that quiet preparation, you can feel the case holding its breath again, not with panic, but with attention. Because attention is what this stage demands most. Attention to words, attention to dates, attention to how a single document can be misunderstood if it's not introduced correctly.